Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and we are back with more Greek mythology. Today we'll be starting the chapter on the less important myths. Well, the part on the less important myths. But yeah, with that said, let's go ahead and jump right into this. Part 6, the less important myths. Chapter 20, Midas and Others. The story of Midas is best told by Ovid, from whom I have taken it. Pindar is my authority for Asclepius, whose life he tells in full. These Daenids are the subject of one of the plays of Aeschylus. Glaucus and Scylla, Pomona and Vertumnus, and Aristophanes all come from Ovid. Midas, whose name has become a synonym for a rich man, has very little profit from his riches. The experience of possessing them lasted for less than a day, and it threatened him with speedy death. He was an example of folly being as fatal as sin, for he meant no harm. He merely did not use any intelligence. His story suggests that he had none to use. He was king of Phrygia, the land of roses, and he had great rose gardens near his palace. Into them once strayed old Silenus, who, intoxicated as always, had wandered off from Bacchus's train, where he belonged, and lost his way. The fat old drunkard was found asleep in a bower of roses by some of the servants of the palace. They bound him with rosy garlands, set a flowering wreath on his head, woke him up, and bore him in this ridiculous guise to Midas as a great joke. Midas welcomed him and entertained him for 10 days. Then he led him to Bacchus, who, delighted to get him back, told Midas whatever wish he made would come true. Without giving a thought to the inevitable result, Midas wished that whatever he touched would turn to gold. Of course, Bacchus, in granting this favor, foresaw what would happen at the next meal, but Midas saw nothing until the food he lifted to his lips became a lump of metal. Dismayed and very hungry and thirsty, he was forced to hurry off to the god and implore him to take his favor back. Bacchus told him to go wash in the source of the river Pactolus, and he would lose the fatal gift. He did so, and that was said to be the reason why gold was found in the sands of the river. Later on, Apollo changed Midas's ears into those of an ass. But again, the punishment was for stupidity, not for any wrongdoing. He was chosen as one of the umpires of a musical contest between Apollo and Pan. The rustic god could play very pleasing tunes on his pipes of reed, but when Apollo struck his silver lyre, there was no sound on earth or in heaven that could equal the melody except only the choir of the muses. Nevertheless, although the umpire, the mountain god, Tumulus, gave the palm to Apollo, Midas, no more intelligent musically than in any other way, honestly preferred Pan. Of course, this was double stupidity on his part. Ordinary prudence would have reminded him that it was dangerous to side against Apollo with Pan, infinitely the less powerful. And so he got his ass's ears. Apollo said that he was merely giving to ears so dull and dense the proper shape. Midas had hid them under a cap, especially made for that purpose, but the servant who cut his hair was obliged to see them. He swore a solemn oath never to tell. But the secrecy so weighed upon the man that he finally went and dug a hole into a field and spoke softly into it. King Midas has ass's ears. Then he felt relieved and filled the hole up. But in the spring reeds grew up there, and when stirred by the wind, they whispered those buried words and revealed to men not only the truth, but of what had happened to the poor stupid king, but also that when gods are contestants, and the only safe course is to side with the strongest. Asculapius. There was a maiden in Thessaly named Coronis, of beauty so surpassing that Apollo loved her. But strangely enough, she did not care long for her divine lover. She preferred a mere mortal. She did not reflect that Apollo, the god of truth, who never deceived, could not himself be deceived. The Pythian lord of Delphi, he had a comrade he can trust, straightforward, never wandering astray. It is his mind which knows all things, which never touches falsehood, which no one, or god or mortal, can outwit. He sees whether the deed is done or only planned. Coronus was foolish indeed to hope that he would not learn of her faithlessness. It is said that the news was brought to him by his bird, the raven, then pure white with beautiful snowy plumage, and that Apollo, in a fit of furious anger, and with the complete injustice the gods usually showed when they were angry, punished the faithful messenger by turning his feathers black. Of course, Coronus was killed. Some say that the god did it himself, others that he got Artemis to shoot one of her unerring arrows at her. In spite of his ruthlessness, he felt a pang of grief as he watched the maiden placed on the funeral pyre and the wild flames roar up. At least I will save my child, he said to himself, and just as Zeus had done when Semele perished, he snatched away the babe which was very near birth. He took it to Chiron, the wise and kindly old centaur, to bring up in his cave on Mount Pelion, and told him to call the child Aesculapius. Many notables had given Chiron their sons to rear, but of all his pupils the child of dead Coronus was dearest to him. He was not like other lads, forever running about and bent on sport. He wanted most of all to learn whatever his foster father could teach him about the art of healing. And that was not a little. Chiron was learned in the use of herbs and gentle incantations and cooling potions, but his pupil surpassed him. He was able to give aid in all manner of maladies, whoever came to him suffering, whether from wounded limbs or bodies wasting away with disease, even those who were sick unto death, he delivered from their torment. A gentle craftsman who drove pain away, soother of cruel pangs, a joy to men, bringing them golden health. He was a universal benefactor, and yet he too drew down on himself the anger of the gods, and by the sin the gods never forgave. He thought thoughts too great for man. He was once given a large fee to raise one from the dead, and he did so. It is said by many that the man called back to life was Hippolytus, Theus's son, who died so unjustly, and that he never again fell under the power of death, but lived in Italy, immortal forever, where he was called Virbius and worshipped as a god. However, the great physician who had delivered him from Hades had no such happy fate. Zeus would not allow a mortal to have the power over the dead, and he struck Aesculapius with his thunderbolt and slew him. Apollo, in great anger at his son's death, went to Etna, where the Cyclopes forged the thunderbolts, and killed with his arrows, some say the Cyclopes themselves, some say their sons. Zeus, greatly angered in his turn, condemned Apollo to serve King Admetus as a slave for a period which is differently given as 1 or 9 years. It was this Admetus whose wife Alcestis Hercules rescued from Hades. But Aesculapius was, even though he had so displeased the king of the gods and men, was honored on earth as no other mortal. For hundreds of years after his death, the sick and the maimed and the blind came for healing to his temples. There they would pray and sacrifice, and after that go to sleep. Then in their dreams the good physician would reveal to them how they could be cured. Snakes played some part in the cure, but what is not known, but they were held to be the sacred servants of Aesculapius. It is certain that thousands upon thousands of sick people through the centuries believed that he had freed them from their pain and restored them to health. The Danaids. These maidens are famous, far more so than anyone reading their story would expect. They were often referred to by the poets, and they are among the most prominent sufferers in the hell of mythology, where they must forever try to carry the water in leaking jars. Yet, except for one of them, Hypermnestra, they did only what the Argonauts found the women of Lemnos had done. They killed their husbands. Nevertheless, the Lemnians are hardly ever mentioned, while everyone who knows even a little about mythology has heard of the Daenids. They were 50 of them, all of them daughters of Danaus, or Danaus, one of Io's descendants, who dwelt by the Nile. Their 50 cousins, sons of Danaus's brother Aegyptus, wanted to marry them, which for some unexplained reason they were absolutely opposed to doing. They fled with their father by ship to Argos, where they found sanctuary. The Argives voted unanimously to maintain the right of the suppliant. When the sons of Aegyptus arrived, ready to fight to gain their brides, the city repulsed them. They would allow no woman to be forced to marry against her will, they told the newcomers, nor would they surrender any suppliant, no matter how feeble and no matter how powerful the pursuer. At this point, there is a break in the story. When it is resumed in the next chapter, so to speak, the maidens are being married to their cousins, and their father is presiding over in the marriage feast. There is no explanation of how this came about, but at once it is clear that it was not through any change of mind in either Danaus or his daughters. Because of the feast, he is represented as giving each girl a dagger. As the event shows, all of them had been told what to do and agreed. After their marriage, in the dead of night, they killed their bridegrooms. Everyone except Hypermnestra. She alone was moved by pity. She looked at the strong young man lying motionless in sleep beside her, and she could not strike with her dagger to change that glowing vigor into cold death. Her promise to her father and her sisters was forgotten. She was, the Latin poet Horace says, splendidly false. She woke the youth. His name was Lancaeus, told him all and helped him flee. Her father threw her into prison for her treachery to him. One story says that she and Lancaeus came together again and lived at last in happiness, and that their son was Abas, the great-grandfather of Perseus. The other stories end with a fatal wedding night and her imprisonment. All of them, however, tell of the unending futility of the task the 49 Daenids were compelled to pursue in the lower world as a punishment for murdering their husbands. At the river's edge, they filled forever jars riddled with holes, so that the water poured away and they must return to fill them again. And again see them drained dry. Glaucus and Scylla. Glaucus was a fisherman who was fishing one day from a green meadow which sloped down into the sea. He had spread his catch out on the grass and was counting the fish when he saw them all begin to stir, and then moving toward the waters, slip into it and swim away. He was utterly amazed. Had a god done this, or was there some strange power in the grass? He picked a handful and ate it. At once an irresistible longing for the sea took possession of him. There was no denying it. He ran and leaped into the waves. The sea gods received him kindly and called on Ocean and Tethys to purge his mortal nature away and make him one of them. 100 rivers were summoned to pour their waters upon him. He lost consciousness in the rushing flood. When he recovered, he was a sea god with hair green like the sea, and a body ending in a fish's tail. To the dwellers in the water, a fine and familiar form, but strange and repellent to the dwellers on earth. So he seemed to the lovely nymph Scylla when she was bathing in a little bay and caught sight of him rising from the sea. She fled from him until she stood on a lofty promontory where she could safely watch him, wondering at the half-man, half-fish. Glaucus called up to her, "Maiden, I am no monster. I am a god with power over the waters, and I love you." But Scylla turned from him and, hastening inland, was lost to his sight. Glaucus was in despair, for he was madly in love, and he determined to go to Circe, the enchantress, and beg her for the love potion to melt Scylla's hard heart. But as he told her his tale of love and implored her help, Circe fell in love with him. She wooed him with her sweetest words and looks, but Glaucus would have none of her. "Trees will cover the sea bottom and seaweed the mountain tops before I cease to love Scylla," he told her. Circe was furiously angry, but with Scylla, not Glaucus. She prepared a vial of very powerful poison, and going to the bay where Scylla bathed, she poured into it the baleful liquid. As soon as Scylla entered the water, she was changed into a frightful monster. Out from her body grew serpents and fierce dogs' heads. The beastly forms were part of her. She could not fly from them or push them away. She stood there rooted to a rock in an unutterable misery, hating and destroying everything that came within her reach, a peril to all sailors who passed near her, such as Jason and Odysseus and Aeneas found out. So she became the sea monster Scylla. Erysichthon. One woman had power given to her to assume different shapes, power as great as Proteus had. She used it, strangely enough, to procure food for her starving father. Her story is the only one in which the good goddess Ceres appears cruel and vindictive. Erysichthon had the wicked audacity to cut down the tallest oak in a grove sacred to Ceres. His servants shrank from the sacrilege when he ordered them to fell it, whereupon he seized an axe himself and attacked the mighty trunk around which the dryads used to hold their dances. Blood flowed from the tree when he struck it, and a voice came from within. warning him that Ceres would surely punish his crime. But these marvels did not check his fury. He struck again and again until the great oak crashed to the ground. The Dryads hastened to Ceres to tell her what had happened, and the goddess, deeply offended, told them she would punish the criminal in a way never known before. She sent one of them in her car to the bleak region where famine dwells to order her to take possession of Erysichthon. Bid her see to it, Ceres said, that no abundance shall ever satisfy him. He shall starve in the very act of devouring food. Famine obeyed the command. She entered Erysichthon's room where he slept, and she wrapped her skinny arms around him. Holding him in her foul embrace, she filled him with herself and planted hunger within him. He woke with a raging desire for food and called for something to eat. But the more he ate, the more he wanted. Even as he crammed meat down his throat, he starved. He spent all his wealth on vast supplies of food, which never gave him a moment's satisfaction. At last he had nothing left except his daughter. He sold her too. On the seashore, where her owner's ship lay, she prayed to Poseidon to save her from slavery, and the god heard her prayer. He changed her into a fisherman. Her master, who had been but a little behind her, saw on the long stretch of beach only the figure of a man busy with his fishing lines. He called to him, Where has that girl gone who was here a moment ago? Here are her footprints, and they suddenly stop. The supposed fisherman answered, I swear by the god of the sea that no man except myself has come to this shore, and no woman either. When the other, completely bewildered, had gone off in his boat, and the girl returned to her own shape. She went back to her father and delighted him by telling him what had happened. He saw an endless opportunity of making money by her. He sold her again and again. Each time Poseidon changed her, now into a mare, now into a bird, and so on. Each time she escaped from her owner and came back to her father. But at last, when the money she thus earned for him was not enough for his needs, he turned upon his own body and devoured it until he killed himself. Pomona and Vertumnus. These two were Roman divinities, not Greek. Pomona was the only nymph who did not love the wild woodland. She cared for fruits and orchards, and that was all she cared for. Her delight was in the pruning and grafting and everything that belongs to the gardener's art. She shut herself away from men, alone with her beloved trees, and let no wooer come near her. Of all that sought her, Vertumnus was the most ardent, but he could make no headway. Often he had been able to enter her presence in disguise, now as a rude reaper bringing her a basket of barley ears, now as a clumsy herdsman or a vine pruner. At such times he had the joy of looking at her, but also the wretchedness of knowing she would never look at such a one as he seemed to be. At last, however, he made a better plan. He came to her disguised as a very old woman, so that it did not seem strange to Pomona when, after admiring her fruit, he said to her, "But you are far more beautiful," and kissed her. Still, he kept on kissing her as no old woman would have done, and Pomona was startled. Perceiving this, he let her go and sat down opposite an elm tree over which grew a vine loaded with purple grapes. He said softly, "How lovely they are together, and how different they would be apart. The tree useless and the vine on the ground, unable to bear fruit. Are not you like such a vine? You turn from all who desire you. You will try to stand alone, and yet there is one, listen to an old woman who loves you more than you know. You would do well not to reject Vertumnus. You are his first love and will be his last. And he too cares for the orchard and the garden. He would work by your side." Then, speaking with great seriousness, he pointed out to her how Venus had known many a time that she hated hard-hearted maidens, and he told her the sad story of Anaxarete, who had disdained her suitor Iphis, until in despair he hanged himself from the gate-post, whereupon Venus turned the heartless girl into a stone image. "Be warned," he begged, "and yield to your true lover." With this, he dropped his disguise and stood before her radiant youth, a radiant youth. Pomona yielded to such beauty, joined to such eloquence, and henceforward her orchards had 2 gardeners. But yeah, that will end that chapter. So yeah, we see the story, some shorter myths. Perhaps the most well-known being Midas. You know, the name is well-known. Anything he touches turns to gold. And they talked about his food and drink turning to gold. And I know in other myths he tried to hug his own daughter and she turned to gold. But yeah. It was Bacchus who freed him. Yeah, Bacchus was the god of drunkenness, whereas Apollo was the god of grapes and wine. So, you know, they would often go together. They would be great friends. So, yeah. But that was an interesting tale. I'd also heard the one about him being given ass's ears. That one's not too new either. I had heard of it, so. So yeah. Aesculapius, they talked about him being a healer of immense talent. And you'll remember that, I can't remember what it's called, but often Mercury is the one, Hermes, I should say. Mercury is the Roman form. Hermes is often seen carrying it. It's the little stick with the snakes on it. And also this one, again, snakes are used in the tale of a great healer. So that's interesting. We had the tale of the Daenids, the girls who did not want to marry their cousins and end up murdering all except one, Hypermnestra, which she was in one of the other tales. I can't remember which one it was, but yeah. Glaucus and Scylla. The man Glaucus was turned into a sea god, and he fell for the nymph Scylla, but she would not return his love. And so Glaucus sought out Circe, which would be Scylla's undoing, as she poisoned Scylla, turning her into the famous monster of the Odyssey of Jason and the Argonauts, and the other tale of Aeneas, where he travels from Troy to found Rome. So yeah, the great sea entity Scylla. Erysichthon. Oh yeah, the guy who chopped down a goddess's tree and got himself screwed over as a result. And so Ceres, being angry, sent famine to bring a serious famine upon him. So much so that he even turned upon himself. And devoured his own body. When I was reading it, and I still do, I was thinking of the tale of the Wendigo. Because, it's of a being that's starving so much, and some of the tales of the Wendigo, it ends up chewing its parts of its own body out of hunger. It would sometimes chew its own lips off and parts of its fingers. Yeah. And then Pomona and Vertumnus. That one, I didn't know how it would end, but it turned out, even though it was kind of an almost coerced relationship, Vertumnus was able to get her to accept him as a suitor, and in the end they ended up being happy together. But yeah, in the beginning of that, it felt a bit like coercion. But yeah. So we are nearing the end. We got a chapter of some very short myths. Yeah. Some very short myths in Greek mythology. Blah blah blah. Yeah, I mean, these are like really short. But you'll recognize some of the names in it, I'm sure. That'll take us to part 7, Mythology of the Norsemen. Again, remember, one of the Norse stories in the I can't remember the name of the book. But anyway, they would proclaim they're originally from Troy. The Edda, yeah. Prose Edda. And in this, they would allude to the fact that they may have been from Troy. So yeah. So in a way, it does make sense to talk about them in Greek mythology, but we'll talk about them, some of the characters in Norse mythology. So we'll go back into Norse mythology a bit. So yeah, that's interesting. And then we'll get a list of families in Greek mythology. And that ends the book. So we're not far off. We're getting there. But we'll go ahead and end this episode here. As always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.